So in today's video, we're going to talk about GDP, gross domestic product, and start looking at the indicators so we can understand where we are at in the business cycle and what we can expect to happen. And then that will eventually lead us to what should the fiscal monetary policy changes be in order to address some of the issues here. So as we're using our three indicators here, when we talk about GDP, we're looking at using it to measure the growth of the economy. So we do that by taking this information every quarter and comparing it to the past to see what is happening. We would like to see GDP increasing because that tells us the economy is growing. So when we talk about GDP, we're talking about the value of all the final goods and services produced within the country in a set period of time. So we're only counting new products, right? If you did the reading, you know there's quite a few things that don't get included, like intermediate goods, things that you use to make a final product. We don't count any used products. If you do something yourself, so like you change your own oil instead of paying someone to do it, that doesn't count. We don't count any illegal activity because they aren't reporting it, so it's hard to count it. So those things aren't included in GDP. And we also don't include anything that happens outside of the country. So if we have an American company that goes to Mexico to manufacture their product, we don't get to count that total in the US GDP, even though it's a US company. We only get to count what's happening within our borders. Okay. And so, like I said, we can take that information and compare it to what was happening before, and we'll be able to tell if there was growth, a period of decline, or if we're being stagnant in the economy, right? And then that can help influence which fiscal and monetary policy should go into place. The goal for any growing country is to have an increasing GDP, right? That typically means that businesses are growing. That tends to mean wages are increasing. That means the standard of living is increasing, and things are advancing. That would be the goal for most systems. Now, how quickly you're able to grow or what that looks like is just dependent on the type of economic system that you are in and the policies of the government. But growth is the goal. Um, we also can use GDP to compare our countries to each other. So we know if we look at Russia or China, which economy is doing better. And then that can tell us some policies to avoid, or that can give us an idea of what is expected to happen in those countries moving forward, and so on. So when we calculate GDP, we're looking at four components. So there's component C, which is consumption, investment, government spending, and something we call net exports, which is simply exports minus imports. So we total up each of these categories and then we add them together, and that gives us our total GDP. So a lot of times you'll see it listed this way: C plus I plus G plus the total of X minus M. Okay, so we'll look at some actual numbers here in a little bit, but we're going to go through these components and look at what is and isn't included in them. So with consumption, we're talking about spending that is done by you and I, individuals, and by households. Okay, anytime you spend your money on something new, you are contributing towards the GDP. Now, again, if you buy used products, you go to thrift stores or you buy from garage sales, uh, that doesn't contribute. Excuse me. But any new products that you buy will contribute to that. So when we look at consumption and we're looking at how do we get the GDP to grow, a lot of it comes back to individuals and how do we get individuals spending more money and having more confidence in the system. So if we see the government say, oh, we're going to increase income tax, that takes money out of the system and that would decrease consumption. Or if the banks make it more difficult to get loans, that would decrease consumption. If it's easier or there is less taxes, then we would see more money flowing through the system because consumers have that ability to spend. If businesses are growing, they a lot of times pass those growth along to workers through wage increases, and that would influence consumption increases. So we can kind of tell what's happening when we look at this. Consumption also helps us measure something called consumer confidence. So If you're going about your life and you feel good about the economy, you think things are trending upwards, and you don't really have any real fears of bad things happening economically speaking, you would have high confidence in the system, and we would see consumption be higher. More people would be spending money. If consumer confidence is low, and let's say you're afraid of losing your job soon or that there's going to be a major recession, we would see less spending and people would be saving more. So, looking at that can help tell us what is kind of more broadly happening in the overall economy here. And that can then help influence, like I said, the monetary and the fiscal policy that takes place. Investment isn't putting money into like the stock market or bonds. When we talk about investment with GDP, we're talking about spending that is done by businesses, in particular, investment back into themselves. So again, we're not counting intermediate goods. So when a business buys resources, that doesn't count towards GDP. But if they're able to increase their supply, they increase their production, that does count towards GDP. So if businesses are growing and they're producing more, that will add to GDP. Some other examples here are listed on the screen. If businesses are like, hey, we have extra money, we're going to expand, so we need more space, that would be an example of investment growing, and that would add to GDP. Or if new businesses are starting, or they're like, let's update the systems, let's buy new equipment so we can produce better and more efficiently, all of that would factor into that investment category. If the banks or the government made it more difficult for businesses to get access to money, that tends to slow down investment. If it's really bad, if consumption's really bad and they stop spending, businesses stop making money, so their investment would go down, there would be less growth, and then that would lead us to some really bad cyclical um, unemployment and would put us in a contraction period. Okay, so we can use investment to again see where we are in this cycle here. The third category is government spending, which should be pretty obvious by the name. This is spending done by the government, both or by both all federal, state, and local governments combined make up this category that factors into GDP. Okay, now one exception to this is that GDP does not count any money spent on social programs. So anything like food stamps or welfare, unemployment, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, any government program like that does not add to government spending, right? And so the reason that we see some countries have lower GDPs is because they have more spending on social programs. The reason we don't count them is because nothing new is being generated. Um, if GDP is only the total of final new goods and services and nothing new is being generated, we can't count that money. Okay, so the Nordic countries that are welfare states, so they spend a lot of money on welfare programs. They tend to have lower GDPs. Socialist economies have lower GDPs where the government is providing most things, they're running most things. And so we wouldn't see as high a GDP numbers as you would in a more capitalistic free market economy. Okay. Now, if people are trying to get GDP to grow and they're like, let's just blow out government spending, it doesn't just happen with no cost, right? In economics, there's a cost for everything. Same comes with government spending. Um, you either have to see an increase in taxes, which would then influence consumption or investment to decrease, or they're just going to increase deficit spending and they're going to increase the national debt. And that can be bad as well if you are at really high debt levels and you're unable to pay back those loans. Okay, so government spending does factor into this and has some influence. Go ahead and go to the next video to finish up looking at GDP.